blood on the floorboards wasn't his. That was the first problem. The second was the silence in the apartment. Heavy, thick with the smell of cheap takeout, copper, and vinegar. When Luke Marino knelt by the couch, he didn't reach for his gun. He reached for a towel. Her jaw was swollen, her lip split so deep it bled onto his thumb. Luke didn't yell. He just leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "Who did this to you?" By dawn, 3 men would be dead. 2 bars would be reduced to ash, and every guy in the city with a guilty conscience would be packing a bag. The fluorescent lights in St. Jude's emergency room hummed like a dying refrigerator. It was 1:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, the hour when the city usually washed its trash into the waiting area. Drunks with split eyebrows, over-enthusiastic college kids from the downtown bars, and the occasional kitchen worker with a burn. Then the glass double doors slid open, and the room went dead silent. It wasn't just the 2 guys in heavy dark wool coats standing by the entrance, their hands resting too casually in their pockets. It was the man between them, carrying a woman wrapped in a beige trench coat that was 2 sizes too big for her. Luke Marino didn't look like the movies. He didn't wear a fedora or pinstripe suits with carnations on the lapel. He wore a charcoal zip-up sweater, dark jeans, and boots that looked like they'd seen mud and concrete in equal measure. His face was the kind of face you didn't stare at twice. Broken nose set slightly off-center, dark eyes with deep bags beneath them, and a jaw tight enough to crack walnuts. He looked like an overworked union delegate or a tired dock boss, except the triage nurse, a 30-year veteran named Brenda, knew exactly who signed the checks for St. Jude's new pediatric wing. She stood up before Luke even reached the desk. "Bay 4, Brenda said. "No questions, no clipboard." "She needs a scan," Luke said. His voice was gravel, worn down by 20 cigarettes a day and too many late-night phone calls. "Head and ribs, now." He set Anna down on the examination table with a gentleness that looked clumsy on a man his size. Her head rolled slightly against the crinkly paper. One eye was swollen completely shut, the lid a nasty, glistening shade of plum and indigo. A jagged tear in her lower lip had stopped bleeding, leaving a dark crust that made her look like a rag doll someone had dragged through a gravel driveway. Anna Wright wasn't a mob wife. She didn't own diamonds, she didn't get her nails done on Tuesdays, and she didn't know how to wash blood out of silk. She was an archivist for the city library, a 28-year-old woman who lived on T, overdue library notices, and a stubborn insistence that people were generally decent if you gave them a chance. She had met Luke Marino 6 months ago when he dropped off 3 boxes of his late mother's old Italian records at the donation desk. He hadn't told her his name. She had scolded him for folding the cardboard flaps wrong. He had stood there, a man who commanded 300 soldiers across 5 boroughs, taking instructions from a woman with ink stains on her knuckles and a pencil stuck in her messy bun. Now, she couldn't even open her mouth to speak. Luke pulled a metal folding chair to the side of the table and sat down. He didn't touch her hand. Her left wrist was turning a bruised yellow-green. The fingers curled inward like a dead spider. He just stared at the pattern of her bruises. A young resident came in, took one look at Luke, and swallowed hard. "Sir, I'm going to need to examine the patient." "Do your job, kid," Luke said, not looking up. "Just don't hurt her more than she already is." When the doctor gently lifted Anna's shirt to check her ribs, Luke didn't look away. He forced himself to catalog every mark. A boot print on the floating rib, a deep purple contusion near the kidney, defensive bruises on the forearms where she'd tried to shield her face. This wasn't a robbery. A mugger hits you once, takes your purse, and runs. This was work. This was someone taking their time. Anna's good eye fluttered open. The brown iris was dilated, glassy with concussion and morphine. She looked at the drop-ceiling tiles, then shifted her gaze to Luke. Her breath hitched, a dry, rattling sound in the quiet bay. "Don't," she whispered. The word barely cleared her throat. Luke leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. He smelled of cold night air, tobacco, and clean laundry. "Don't what, Anna? Don't do what you're thinking." A humorless, dry smile touched the corner of his mouth for a fraction of a second before vanishing. "I'm not thinking anything. I'm sitting here with you." Luke. She tried to reach for his coat, but her fingers wouldn't close. "I mean it. No cops. None of your people." He looked at her hand, hovering an inch above his knee, and gently slid his palm under hers to support it without squeezing. His skin was warm, rough with calluses from a lifetime of handling metal and wood. "Who did this to you?" he asked. The tone wasn't dramatic. It wasn't thunderous. It was the same tone he used when asking his accountant if the quarterly taxes had been filed. Flat, functional, and inevitable. Anna closed her eyes. A tear leaked out of the swollen corner, tracking down the side of her face and stinging the cuts on her cheek. It was dark, 2 guys, in the alley behind the diner. "Why, they asked about you," she breathed. Said if I was going to let a dog eat at my table, I should know how he treats his leashes. The resident froze, holding a syringe of saline in midair. Even the heart monitor seemed to beep quieter. Luke didn't move. He didn't blink. He just sat there for 5 long seconds, his thumb gently brushing the unbruised back of her hand. Then he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the linoleum. "Get some sleep, Anna," he said quietly. "Brenda's going to put you in a private room on the 4th floor. I left 2 of my boys outside the door. They won't bother you. They won't even breathe loud." "Luke," she cried out, stronger this time. "Please." He paused at the curtain, looking back over his shoulder. The harsh overhead light caught the silver in his stubble and the flat, dead emptiness in his eyes. "I'm just going to go get some fresh air," he said. The back of the Lincoln Navigator smelled of leather and black ice air freshener. Luke sat in his passenger seat. The window rolled down 2 inches to let the freezing January wind bite his face. Driving was Dean, a 35-year-old kid from South Boston who had a scarred neck and drove like a grandma when the boss was thinking. In the back seat sat Frank, a man who had been with Luke's father in the 80s and looked like an old bulldog that had survived too many dogfights. "How bad?" Frank asked from the dark. 3 ribs, Luke said, watching the streetlights flicker across the windshield. "Severe concussion. Fracture in the orbital bone. She's going to need surgery on her jaw on Thursday once the swelling goes down." Frank grunted, a heavy, ugly sound. "She didn't give him anything?" "She doesn't know anything to give, Frank," Luke said, turning his head slightly. "She thinks I run a scrap metal logistics firm. She thinks my worst crime is bribing parking enforcement." "They used her to leave a message," Dean said from the wheel, his knuckles white against the leather steering wheel cover. "That means it's someone who knows she exists. You've only been seeing her for 6 months, boss. And you haven't exactly been parading her at the country club. Luke reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of Camel Blues. He lit one, the sulfur flare of the match illuminating his face for a second. Cold, carved out of granite, devoid of the mild manner he'd shown at the hospital bedside. "Who knew?" Luke asked. "Just the inner circle," Frank said. "Me, Dean, Paulie, and maybe the boys at the social club who saw you drop her off after the theater that one time." "People talk," Dean offered gently. "A guy gets a beer in him. He mentions to his cousin that Luke Marino has a regular girl over on 4th Street. It gets around." "No," Luke said. He blew a stream of smoke out the cracked window. "This wasn't gossip. You don't jump a girl in an alley and break her face because you heard a rumor. This was someone testing the perimeter, someone who wants to see if I'm soft or if I'm distracted." The city outside the tinted windows was quiet. It was 2 a.m. now. The financial district was a forest of dark glass towers, the brick tenements of the Lower East Side huddled together under the frost. This was his city. His grandfather had laid the concrete for the docks. His father had taken control of the unions that worked them. Luke had cleaned it up, bought the politicians, and turned a street gang into an empire that looked like a Fortune 500 company on paper. He had spent 10 years building walls so thick no one could touch him. And then he'd walked into a public library, smelled old paper and lavender soap, and left the gate unlocked. "We going to the house?" Dean asked, flicking his turn signal. "No," Luke said. "Go to the meatpacking district. Call Paulie. Tell him to wake up the shift bosses from the East River projects. Tell them I want every name that came through the ports this week. And call the cops." Frank leaned forward. "Which ones?" "Detective Miller, the one on the payroll who thinks he's a good guy because he only takes our money to pay for his kid's asthma medication. Tell him I want the CCTV footage from the alley behind Rossi's diner. If the cameras were broken, tell him to bring me the guy who broke them." "Luke," Frank said quietly, his hand resting on the back of Luke's seat. "If we tear the city apart tonight, the commission in Chicago is going to hear about it by breakfast. We've got the zoning board meeting for the casino project on Thursday. You start dropping bodies in the street, the mayor is going to have to pretend he doesn't know us." Luke flicked his cigarette butt out the window. It sparked against the asphalt before the rear tire crushed it. "Fuck the casino," Luke said, "and fuck the mayor." By 3:15 a.m., the back room of the St. Jude's Social Club, no relation to the hospital, was crowded, but you wouldn't know it from the noise level. 10 men sat around a long, mahogany table that usually hosted Friday night poker games. Today, there were no cards, no drinks, and no cigars. Just an espresso machine hissing in the corner and a stack of yellow legal pads. Luke stood at the head of the table, his coat off, the sleeves of his gray sweater pushed up to his elbows. On the table lay a single black and white photograph printed from a traffic camera 2 blocks from Anna's apartment. It was grainy, the resolution terrible, but it showed 2 figures in heavy puff jackets getting into a silver sedan at 11:45 p.m. "The plate is a dummy," Paulie said. He was 24, a whiz with computers who worked out of a back room at a car dealership. Registered to a dead woman in Queens. But the car, a 2018 Chevy Malibu with a dented rear quarter panel, was picked up by an automated toll reader on the bridge at 12:10 a.m. "Heading where?" Luke asked. "North," Paulie said, "up toward the salvage yards in the Bronx." Luke looked around the table. These were men who had broken bones for him. Men who had sat in federal lockup without saying a word. Men who had daughters and wives they went home to on Sundays. They were looking at him not with fear, but with a quiet, professional anticipation. They knew the rules. You touch a boss's family, you die. You touch a boss's girl, you die slow. There's 3 crews operating out of the salvage yards, Frank said, tracing a finger down a list of names. The Russians run the auto chop shop. The Greeks do the copper wiring. And then there's Jimmy the Rat Callahan. Luke's jaw tightened. Callahan works for the Sullivan brothers. Yeah, Frank said, looking up, his old eyes serious. The Irish have been trying to push into the waterfront freight contract since November. We told them no. They said they'd think about it. They thought about it, Luke said softly. He picked up the photograph, staring at the blurred shape of the driver. He didn't feel rage. Rage was hot, noisy, and sloppy. What Luke felt was a sudden, massive drop in temperature inside his chest. It was the clarity that comes when a complex math equation suddenly cancels out to 0. "Paulie," Luke said, "call Callahan's house. If his wife answers, hang up. If he answers, don't say anything. Just play the radio." "Why?" "Because if he's sleeping, he didn't do it. A guy who just hit my girl doesn't go home and sleep in his own bed. He stays at a safe house with his boots on." Paulie dialed his cell phone, put it on speaker, and set it on the mahogany table. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, there was a click. A voice came through the speaker, rough, wide awake, and breathing heavily. "Yeah, who's this?" Luke reached out and pressed the end call button with his index finger. He looked at Dean. "Get the vans." The Bronx Auto Yard was a graveyard of rusted metal and broken glass, surrounded by a 12-foot chain-link fence topped with razor wire. At 4:30 a.m., a freezing sleet began to fall, turning the dirt roads into black, greasy mud. 3 black SUVs pulled up to the main gate with their headlights off. They didn't honk. They didn't wait for the guard. Dean got out of the lead car with a pair of bolt cutters, snapped the heavy master lock on the chain, and pushed the gate open. The cars rolled in, tires crunching softly over gravel and old spark plugs, surrounding a double-wide corrugated metal trailer that sat in the middle of the yard, lit by a single yellow security bulb. Luke stepped out of the second car. He reached into the boot of the car and pulled out a 30-inch wooden Louisville Slugger. Not a baseball bat for playing, but an old one weighted with lead core, wrapped in black friction tape around the handle. He didn't carry a gun. If there was shooting to be done, Frank and the 6 guys with automatic carbines surrounding the trailer would handle it. Luke walked up the wooden steps of the trailer. He didn't knock. He raised his right boot and kicked the deadbolt clean out of the cheap particle board doorframe. The door flew inward with a crack like a gunshot. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer and cheap hash. 3 men were sitting around a Formica kitchen table, counting stacks of 20s. They jumped up, reaching for waistbands and under the table, but the windows shattered simultaneously from the outside as 6 red laser dots danced across their chests and foreheads. "Nobody move!" Frank's voice boomed through the broken window from the dark outside. "You move a finger, your mother gets a closed casket." Luke stepped into the trailer. The lead bat hung loosely from his right hand, the tip tapping against his boot with a rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack. Jimmy Callahan was standing by the refrigerator, a fat man in his 50s with a stained undershirt and a bald head covered in sweat. To his left were 2 younger guys, 20s, wearing heavy black puff jackets with grease stains on the cuffs. One of them had a fresh scratch across the bridge of his nose. Luke strode over to the boy with the fresh scratch on his cheek. The kid straightened the moment he saw him coming, puffing out his chest and squaring his shoulders, trying his hardest to look fearless. His jaw tightened into what he probably imagined was an intimidating glare, but the slight tremble in his hands betrayed him. The other boys behind him fell silent, watching nervously. Luke stopped only a step away, his expression calm, almost unreadable, which somehow made him even more intimidating. He glanced at the scrape on the boy's face before meeting his eyes. "What's your name?" Luke asked quietly. "Ricky," the kid answered. His voice cracked despite his best effort to sound confident. He swallowed hard, darting a quick glance at his friends before looking back at Luke. "Look, Mr. Marino, we don't want no trouble." Luke didn't swing the bat from his shoulder. He just flicked his wrist, a short, vicious, upward snap that caught Ricky right in the right kneecap. The sound wasn't loud, just a wet pop like a dry branch snapping underfoot. Ricky didn't even scream at first. His eyes went wide, his mouth opened in a silent "oh," and he collapsed onto the linoleum floor, clutching his leg as his face turned the color of cottage cheese. The other young guy bolted for the back door. He made it 2 steps before Dean stepped inside, caught him by the collar of his jacket, and slammed his face into the side of the refrigerator. The metal dented with a loud bong. Luke didn't look at either of them. He walked over to Jimmy Callahan, who was pressed flat against the huming fridge, his hands up by his ears. "Jimmy," Luke said softly. "Luke, swear to God, I didn't know," Callahan babbled, his eyes darting to the bat, then to Luke's face. "The Sullivan brothers, they just said to rattle her. They said to scare her so you'd drop the waterfront bids. They said don't kill her. You sent these 2 pieces of shit?" Luke asked. He gestured with the bat toward Ricky, who was now sobbing into the dirty floorboards, making high, wheezing noises. "They're just muscle, Luke. They don't know nothing. Mickey Sullivan gave the order from the club in Hell's Kitchen. Please, Luke, I got 3 kids." Luke leaned in close. He smelled Jimmy's fear. It was sour, like old milk. "My girl," Luke said, his voice dropping into a register that made the trailer floor vibrate, "is sitting in a hospital bed with a tube in her arm because she tried to keep your boys from breaking her jaw. She asked me not to hurt anybody." Callahan nodded so hard, his neck seemed ready to snap. Tears welled in his bloodshot eyes and spilled down his weathered cheeks as panic finally overwhelmed whatever pride he had left. His hands shook uncontrollably. "She's a good lady, Luke, a saint," he pleaded, his voice breaking into a desperate sob. "Please, listen to her. She never lies. She only wants those boys safe." Luke never raised his voice. He simply held Callahan's gaze, his expression unreadable. "I am listening to her," he said, evenly. "She said no cops." The finality in those 4 words silenced everyone on the porch. Luke shifted his attention to Dean without another glance at Callahan. "Take the 2 kids to the docks," he ordered. "Put them on the container ship heading to Montevideo. Tell the captain if they get off the boat before Uruguay, I'll sink his fleet." Dean gave a single nod. He knew Luke wasn't making an empty threat. Neither did anyone else. "And him?" Dean asked, nodding toward Callahan. Luke looked Jimmy in the eye for a long moment. Then he raised the bat and brought it down across the kitchen table, smashing the cheap wood into splinters and sending money flying into the air like green leaves in a storm. "You've got 3 hours to pack," Luke told Callahan. "If I see your face in this time zone when the sun comes up, I'm going to let Frank practice his dentistry on you. Get out." It was 5:45 a.m. when the convoy reached Hell's Kitchen. The sleet had turned into a hard, freezing rain that washed the salt off the streets and left everything looking slick and black. The Shamrock and Thistle wasn't a bar, it was a fortress. It had frosted glass windows, heavy oak doors, and a basement that connected to the old subway tunnels under 8th Avenue. Mickey Sullivan and his brother Sean ran their bookmaking and loan sharking operations from the back office. Protected by a dozen ex-boxers and dock workers who worked for pints and cash envelopes, Luke didn't use the back door. He didn't sneak in through the cellar. He walked right through the front entrance, Dean on his left, Frank on his right, and 8 men behind them carrying pump-action shotguns under their long coats. There were 6 guys cleaning up the bar from the night before, mopping up spilled Guinness, stacking chairs on tables. When they saw Luke Marino walk in with his hands empty and his coat open, the mop buckets stopped swinging. One guy reached behind the counter for a baseball bat. Frank pulled his coat back just enough to show the handle of a Glock 19 tucked into his waistband. The guy slowly raised his hands and stepped back from the bar. "Where's Mickey?" Luke asked the bartender, an old guy with a cauliflower ear. The bartender swallowed. "Upstairs, office." Luke didn't say thank you. He walked through the dining room, his boots thudding against the hardwood floor, and climbed the narrow stairs to the 2nd floor. The door to the office was locked. Luke didn't kick this one. He just stood back while Dean took a crowbar from inside his coat and wedged it into the frame. 2 heaves, and the deadbolt snapped with a screech of tearing metal. Inside, Mickey Sullivan was sitting behind a steel desk, a plate of cold eggs and a bottle of scotch between his elbows. He was 42, wearing a tailored suit with no tie, his red hair thinned back from a high forehead. Beside him sat his younger brother, Sean, who was cleaning the fingernails of his left hand with a small pocket knife. Neither of them jumped. They just looked up, their faces tightening into masks of professional offense. "Luke," Mickey said, leaning back in his leather chair, "this is bad manners. You want to sit down, you call Frank, I call Paulie. We go to a neutral hotel. You don't break my door at 6 in the morning." Luke walked up to the desk. He didn't sit down. He didn't put his hands on the wood. He just looked at Mickey with an expression so completely devoid of anger, it made Sean stop scraping his nails. "You touched Anna," Luke said. Mickey sighed, picking up his glass of scotch and swirling the amber liquid. "We sent a message, Luke. That's business. You've been locking us out of the Pier 4 freight line since the summer. We tried reasoning with you. We tried offering a percentage. You didn't listen. A man gets distracted by a girl. Sometimes he needs to be reminded where his focus should be." "She's a librarian, Mickey," Luke said. His voice was very quiet. "She doesn't know what a freight line is." "She's yours," Sean chimed in from the corner, his voice arrogant, laced with the confidence of a guy who had never been hit hard enough to lose teeth. "That makes her part of the board. You don't want your toys broken? Keep 'em in the toy box." Luke didn't look at Sean. He kept his eyes on Mickey. "You think this is chess," Luke said. "It is chess," Mickey said, taking a sip of his drink. "You took our bishop on the zoning board. We took a pawn. Now we sit down, we figure out the division of the waterfront, and everybody goes back to making money." Luke reached across the desk. He didn't move fast, but he moved with such absolute weight that Mickey couldn't react in time. Luke's large hand closed around Mickey's throat, thumb pressing deep into the soft hollow below the Adam's apple, lifting the 42-year-old man half out of his chair and slamming his head down onto the steel desk with a dull, heavy thud. Sean jumped up, raising the pocket knife, but Frank was already there. A heavy leather-gloved fist caught Sean on the side of the jaw, sending him crashing into a glass bookcase that shattered over him in a cascade of law books and dust. Luke held Mickey down on the desk. Mickey was gagging, his hands clawing uselessly at Luke's wrist, his face turning the color of an eggplant. "It's not chess," Luke whispered into Mickey's ear, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and mint. "Chess has rules. Chess has a board. What you did was bring a baseball bat into my house and hit someone who doesn't even know we're playing a game." He leaned his weight down, his forearm crushing Mickey's windpipe just enough to stop the air without breaking the cartilage. "By noon today," Luke said, his voice rhythmic and steady, "your union delegates on Pier 4 are going to resign. By 2 o'clock, your bookmaking offices in Queens are going to be burned to the brick. And if I ever hear you say her name again, if I ever see one of your cars within 10 miles of the borough where she sleeps, I won't send muscle. I'll come myself, and I'll start with your knees and work my way up." Luke let go. Mickey collapsed backward into his chair, gasping wildly, spit running down his chin as he clutched his throat. Luke pulled a clean white handkerchief from his pocket, wiped his right hand carefully, and dropped the rag onto Mickey's cold eggs. "Let's go," Luke said to Frank. As they walked out of the office, stepping over Sean, who was groaning among the broken glass on the floor, Dean looked back. "Boss," Dean asked softly as they hit the stairs, "you think they'll get the message?" "They'll get it," Luke said, pulling his coat collar up against the cold air drifting in from the street door. "Because they know I didn't kill him. And a man like Mickey Sullivan is more terrified of living without his money and his pride than he is of dying." The sun wasn't up yet, but the sky over the East River had turned the color of lead soup, that dirty, freezing gray that only winter in the city can produce. It was 6:45 a.m. when Luke walked back through the revolving doors of St. Jude's Hospital. He smelled different now. The clean laundry smell was gone, replaced by the sour tang of wet wool, cheap diner grease, and the distinct copper and smoke aroma of the shamrock and thistle. He didn't take the elevator. He walked up the 4 flights of stairs, his heavy boots echoing in the concrete stairwell, each step slower and heavier than the last. The adrenaline that had carried him through the night, the cold, clinical focus that had let him break a man's knee and choke a boss without his pulse rising above 80, was evaporating. What was left was an exhaustion so deep it felt like lead weights behind his eyes. Outside room 412, 2 of his guys, big silent kids in black sweaters, stood up from their plastic chairs as he approached. "Any problems?" Luke asked. "No, Mr. Marino," one of them whispered. "Nurse came by twice to change her drip. She slept most of the time. Woke up about 20 minutes ago. Asked what time it was." Luke nodded. "Go get some coffee. Wait in the lobby." He pushed the heavy wooden door open slowly. The room was dark, the blinds drawn against the miserable gray dawn outside. The only light came from the green digits of the vital signs monitor and the soft yellow glow of the bathroom light left on a crack. Anna was lying on her back, the head of the bed raised 30 degrees. Her face was worse than it had been at midnight. The swelling had peaked. Her left cheek was a massive, shiny mound of blackened purple skin that pulled her eye completely shut. Her lip was sewn with 5 tiny black stitches that looked like spider legs against her pale skin. She looked small. That was the thing that hit him hardest. How tiny she looked under the hospital blanket, like a pile of laundry someone had forgotten to fold. He pulled the metal folding chair up to the bedside, making sure it didn't scrape this time. He sat down, took off his coat, and let it drop to the floor beside him. He looked at his hands. His knuckles were red, the skin dry and cracked from the freezing rain, but clean of blood. Her good eye opened. She didn't turn her head. The neck brace they'd put on her as a precaution kept her chin pointed straight up at the ceiling tiles. "You smell like smoke," she whispered. Her voice was better now, hydrated by the IV, but still scratchy and weak. "I had a cigarette," he said. "You had more than one." He didn't answer. He reached out and touched the edge of her blanket, his thick, rough fingers playing with the blue cotton hem. "What time is it?" she asked. 7, he said. "The library is opening soon. I called your boss, left a message on the machine, told him you had a family emergency and you'd be out for a couple of weeks." She was silent for a long time. The monitor beeped. Thump, 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 steady and slow. "Did you hurt them?" she asked. The question hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp as a razor. Luke didn't look away from her good eye. He didn't lie. A man like Luke Marino didn't lie to the people he cared about. It was the only rule he had left that separated him from the men he killed. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Bad? Bad enough so they won't come back." She closed her eye. A long, shuddering sigh went out of her, causing her bruised ribs to catch. She winced, her hand twitching toward her side before stopping. "I didn't want that," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I told you I didn't want that, Luke." "I know," he said. "But you don't get a vote on this, Anna. Not in my world." "Then I don't want to be in your world," she said, raising her voice just enough to make her wince again. "I'm a librarian, Luke. I sort books. I help kids find books about dinosaurs. I don't get beaten up in alleys because some man I'm seeing has an argument over whatever it is you do." He sat there, taking the words like a boxer, taking jabs to the ribs, unmoving, absorbing the impact without flinching. "You're right," he said softly. "I'm looking at you," she said, her good eye wide now, shiny with tears that couldn't fall because of the swelling around her cheek. "And I don't even know who you are. You're so quiet. You're always so polite. You hold the door for old ladies at the diner. You remember how many sugars I take in my tea. And then you leave for 6 hours, and you come back looking like someone who just..." She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't have the words for what he looked like. But Luke had the words. He'd seen that look in his father's mirror every day of his life. "I'm the guy who keeps you from getting hit a second time," Luke said. His voice wasn't defensive. It was just a statement of fact, like saying the sky was gray or the water was cold. "That's who I am, Anna. You want a guy who calls the cops and waits 4 hours to file a report while you sit in an ER with a broken jaw, you can find one. There's 8 million of them in this city, but that's not me." She looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the lines around his mouth, the exhaustion in his shoulders, the quiet, terrifying certainty in his eyes. "You're dangerous," she whispered. "Only to the people who hurt you," he said. He reached out and finally took her hand, her right hand, the one without the bruises. He held it between both of his palms, warming her cold fingers against his rough skin. She didn't pull away. She didn't squeeze back either. She just let her hand lie there in his, a small, fragile thing protected by two scarred paws. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'm going to stay right here." "You need to work," she murmured, the pain medication starting to drag her back under. "I'm the boss," he said, a tiny, sad smile touching his lips. "I gave myself the day off." By 8 a.m., the city was awake, but it was moving differently than it had on Monday. In the diners along the waterfront, the dock bosses were sitting over their coffees, looking at their phones with raised eyebrows. In the back rooms of the social clubs in Queens and Brooklyn, men were making phone calls that weren't being answered. A rumor is a funny thing in a city like New York. It doesn't travel through the newspapers or the television broadcasts. It travels through the guys who deliver the linen to the restaurants. It travels through the parking garage attendants who notice which cars didn't come back last night. It travels through the cops who see 5 different unmarked cruisers parked outside a hospital in the East Village and decide not to write a ticket. By the time the stock market opened at 9 o'clock, everybody who mattered knew 3 things. First, Mickey Sullivan had lost the Pier 4 freight contracts and was currently sitting in a private clinic in Westchester with a crushed windpipe and a broken wrist. Second, 2 of the Sullivan crew's best muscle had boarded a freighter bound for South America without their luggage or their wallets. Third, and most importantly, Luke Marino had a girl, and if you looked at her wrong, he would burn your house down while you were still inside it. In the small coffee shop across the street from St. Jude's, Frank sat at a corner table with Detective Miller. The detective was a 45-year-old guy in a cheap suit, his eyes red from a double shift, eating a bran muffin with the enthusiasm of a man chewing cardboard. Frank slid a thick manila envelope across the table. It landed next to Miller's coffee cup with a soft thwood. "What's this?" Miller asked, not touching it. "That's the CCTV footage from the diner," Frank said, pouring himself a cup of black coffee from a small steel pot. "And a signed confession from Ricky the Leg Russo, admitting he broke into a car on 4th Street last night and resisted arrest when some local citizens tried to stop him." Miller sighed, rubbing his forehead with 2 fingers. "Frank, there's 3 fire trucks currently putting out a blaze at a betting parlor in Astoria. The fire marshal says it smells like gasoline and old tires." "Kids today," Frank said, shaking his head sadly. "No respect for property, probably playing with fireworks." "And Jimmy Callahan?" Miller asked, looking up. "His wife called the precinct at 6 this morning, said he packed 2 suitcases, took the family dog, and drove toward the New Jersey Turnpike crying his eyes out. Jimmy always had seasonal affective disorder," Frank said, taking a sip of his coffee. "He needs the sun. I think he went to Florida. Good for his joints." Miller stared at Frank for a long time. The detective wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what had happened between midnight and dawn. He knew the city was quieter today than it had been in 6 months. The Irish weren't pushing the docks anymore. The auto theft rings in the Bronx were shut down for the week. The streets were clean, not because the law had cleaned them, but because a guy in a gray sweater had decided he didn't want any noise while his girl was sleeping. Miller reached out, picked up the manila envelope, and dropped it into his briefcase. "Tell Luke," Miller said quietly, "that the district attorney is doing a press conference on Friday about waterfront crime. Tell him to keep his people off the street until Monday." "Luke's taking a vacation," Frank said. "He's reading books." At 10:30 a.m., a delivery boy dropped the Tuesday edition of the Daily Post onto the nurse's station desk on the 4th floor of St. Jude's Hospital. The headline wasn't about the betting parlor fire or the sudden management changes on the waterfront. It was about the transit strike and the cold weather. In the back pages, under the local news section, there was a 2-inch column about a suspected gang-related vandalism incident at an auto salvage yard in the Bronx, where no charges had been pressed due to lack of witnesses. In room 412, the sunlight was finally trying to push through the gray clouds, casting a pale, milky light across the foot of Anna's bed. Luke was still sitting in the metal chair. He had his reading glasses on, cheap, wire-rimmed ones he bought at the drugstore, and he was reading a paperback copy of a history book about the Erie Canal that he'd found in her tote bag when they brought her in. He looked ridiculous. A 6'2" mob boss with a broken nose and scarred knuckles sitting in a hospital room reading about 19th century barge construction with a pencil in his hand to underline things he thought were interesting. Anna woke up without the gasp this time. The pain was still there, a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to sit behind her eyes and radiate down into her teeth, but her mind was clearer. The fog of the concussion was lifting, leaving behind the sharp, cold reality of what had happened. She watched him for 5 minutes before he noticed her eyes were open. He was turning a page, his large thumb carefully separating the cheap paper so it wouldn't tear. "Is it good?" she asked. Luke jumped slightly, a tiny jerk of his shoulders, then looked over his glasses at her. He smiled, a real one this time, the kind that made the crinkles around his eyes show. "It's dry," he said, closing the book and taking off his glasses. "The guy who wrote it really likes concrete, spent 40 pages talking about how they mix the cement for the locks." "That's chapter 4, she said, her voice stronger. "It gets better in chapter 5 when the Irish laborers go on strike." "I'll take your word for it," he said. He reached for a plastic cup of water with a straw in it, holding it to her lips so she could take a small sip without moving her head. She drank slowly, her throat clicking with each swallow. When she finished, she looked at the window, then back at him. "My sister called?" she asked. "Yeah," Luke said. "Around 9. I told her you had a bad fall on the ice outside the library. Told her you hit your head and cracked a rib. She wanted to come up from Philadelphia, but I told her the roads were frozen, and you were sleeping anyway." "You lied to my sister," she said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was just an observation." "I protected your sister," he corrected her gently. "She comes up here. She sees 2 guys in black coats outside your door. She starts asking questions you don't want to answer." Anna closed her eyes, letting her head sink deeper into the stiff hospital pillow. "I don't even know what questions to ask, Luke." "You don't need to ask any," he said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the bed frame. "Here's what you need to know. You're going to stay here until Thursday. Then Brenda is going to arrange for a private ambulance to take you to a house I own up in Dutchess County. It's quiet. There's 50 acres of woods, a fireplace that actually works, and a housekeeper named Mrs. Gable who makes the best chicken soup you've ever had in your life." "And you?" she asked, looking at him. "Where are you going to be?" "I'm going to be sitting on the porch with a shotgun," he said flatly, "until your jaw heals and you can tell me whether you want me to leave or not." "And if I say I want you to leave?" she asked. "If I say I never want to see you again because of what you do?" Luke looked down at his hands. He rubbed his thumb across his knuckles, feeling the dry, cracked skin where he'd hit Ricky Russo 20 hours ago. "Then I'll leave," he said quietly. "I'll give you the keys to the house. I'll put a trust fund in your name that pays your rent and your book bills for the rest of your life. And I'll never walk into that library again." He looked up at her, his dark eyes steady, clear, and completely devoid of the hard edge that had terrified Mickey Sullivan. "But I'm not going to let you stay in that apartment on 4th Street, he said. "Not after this. You're mine now, Anna. Not like a car or a house, but the city knows your face, and that means I'm responsible for what happens to it." Anna looked at him for a long, quiet minute. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the gray shadows under his eyes, the slight tremble in his fingers when he reached for his coffee cup, the weight of a city he carried on his back like an old, dirty coat. She didn't like what he did. She hated the violence. She hated the fear. And she hated the fact that 3 men had probably spent the night bleeding in basements because of her. But as she looked at the man sitting beside her, the man who had read 40 pages about cement just to stay awake while she slept, she realized something that made her heart ache more than her broken ribs. She wasn't afraid of him. Everybody else in the city was. Every guy who ran a bar, every union boss who took a bribe, every punk with a knife in an alley. They all feared Luke Marino, but she didn't, because she knew the difference between a monster who kills for pleasure and a man who builds a fence around the only clean thing he's ever found in his life. She reached out her right hand, her small, pale fingers sliding across the white sheet until they touched his wrist. "Chapter 5, she whispered, her lip curling into a tiny, painful smile. "Read me Chapter 5, Luke, and don't skip the parts about the Irish." Luke looked down at her hand on his wrist. Then he picked up the book, opened it to page 84, adjusted his cheap drugstore glasses on his nose, and began to read in his low, gravelly voice, while the city outside the window went back to its quiet, fearful business. 3 weeks later, the snow in Dutchess County wasn't the gray, oil-stained slush that choked the gutters of the city. Out here, 80 miles north of the bridges and the shipping lanes, it fell heavy, blinding, and clean. It piled 2 feet deep against the dark cedar siding of the cabin, muffling the wind until the only sounds left in the world were the crackle of burning pine logs and the slow, rhythmic ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the hall. Anna sat in the deep leather armchair by the frost-rimed window, a heavy gray wool blanket draped over her lap. Her face had changed. The angry, glistening plum color that had swollen her left eye shut at St. Jude's had faded to a dull, sickly yellow-green along her jawline, the color of old, water-damaged parchment. The stitches were out of her lower lip, leaving behind a pale, slightly raised notch that made her mouth look a little harder, a little less forgiving than it used to be. She still moved with a conscious, deliberate slowness. The 3 cracked ribs were knitting together beneath her sweater, but they reminded her of their existence with a blunt, metallic ache every time the draft hit her chest or she reached too far for her tea. On her lap rested a thick slate notebook and a laptop, connected to the cabin's spotty satellite Wi-Fi. Spread across the side table beside her were 6 sheets of yellowed, thick fiber vellum, an original 1742 topographical survey of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Luke had brought them back from a weekend drive to Boston 2 days ago. He had walked into an estate auction house on Newberry Street in a heavy shearling coat, sat in the back row without raising his paddle once, and somehow walked out with the entire maritime collection. When Anna had asked him how much he'd paid, he just told her the auctioneer had been very motivated to close the sale before lunch. She hadn't asked again, She was learning that in Luke's world, a man's reputation was a currency that bought things money simply couldn't. The heavy front door groaned open, breaking the cabin's silence and letting in a sharp, biting gust of 0-degree mountain air. Luke walked in, carrying 2 brown paper grocery bags from the general store down in the valley. He looked different here. In the city, he wore dark wool coats and zip-up sweaters like a uniform of armor, his shoulders always set tight against some unseen impact. Today, he wore a faded red flannel shirt over a thermal undershirt, his dark hair dusted with melting snowflakes, his work boots caked with white powder. He looked like what his grandfather had probably been before the docks and the unions took over, a laborer. A man who worked with wood and stone until his hands were too rough to feel the cold. He kicked the door shut with his heel, stamped his boots on the coarse hemp mat, and carried the bags into the kitchen. Mrs. Gable said the delivery truck from Poughkeepsie slid off the turnpike this morning, Luke said, his low, gravelly voice carrying easily across the open-plan cabin. He pulled a loaf of sourdough and a carton of eggs from the paper bag. They were out of the Earl Grey you like. So I went into the back office and bought the owner's private tin right off his desk. Anna looked up from her screen, her lip curling into a small, careful smile that didn't stretch the healing skin of her cheek. You're shaking down grocers for tea now? It's not a shakedown, Luke said, turning on the brass faucet to wash his hands. The hot water steamed over his knuckles that were finally healed, the split skin from Ricky Russo's jaw replaced by fresh, pink calluses from chopping birch logs behind the shed. I gave him $50 and told him I wouldn't call the town council about the plow schedule on the main road. It's civic negotiation. He dried his hands on a towel, poured boiling water from the cast iron kettle into a ceramic mug, and walked over to her chair. He moved quietly for a man who weighed 220 pounds. He didn't hover over her. He just set the steaming mug on a coaster beside the colonial maps, then crouched down on one knee so his face was level with hers. He reached out, his thick thumb brushing the air just a millimeter above the yellowing bruise on her cheekbone. He didn't touch the skin. He was still terrified of hurting her, even now, even when the swelling was long gone. "How's the jaw today?" he asked. His eyes, usually so dark and unreadable during sit-downs at the social club, were clear and entirely focused on her. "It only hurts when I try to decipher 18th century handwriting," she said, leaning her face just a fraction of an inch into his warmth until her cheek rested gently against his rough thumb. "And when your phone rings." Luke went still. The domestic ease drained out of him in a single heartbeat, replaced by that flat, terrifying blankness she had seen in the ER at midnight. The muscle in his jaw flexed once. "Who called?" he asked softly. "Frank," she said. She didn't look away from him. "He rang the landline about an hour ago. He didn't want to wake you if you were sleeping, but he said it couldn't wait until Monday." Luke let his hand drop to his knee. "The zoning board." "Yeah," she said, picking up her tea and letting the steam warm her face. "He said Mickey Sullivan sent a proxy to the municipal meeting in Queens this morning. They're doing the preliminary vote on the Pier 4 waterfront park project. Frank wanted to know if you were driving down to put your thumb on the scale." The silence in the cabin stretched out. Outside, the wind howled through the bare branches of the maples, rattling the window pane. In the old days, 3 weeks ago, Luke would have been putting his coat on before she finished the sentence. He would have called Dean, ordered 3 cars to the highway, and been sitting in the back of the zoning board meeting by noon with a look on his face that made the commissioners sweat through their cheap suits. He looked down at the wooden floorboards, his shoulders sinking slightly under the invisible weight of the 5 boroughs. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were out," Anna said simply. "I told him you had 45 maps of colonial Massachusetts that needed to be categorized by harbor depth before the snow melts, and that you didn't have time to argue about zoning laws." Luke looked up, his dark eyes widening slightly. "You said that to Frank?" "I did," she said, taking a slow sip of her tea. "And then I told him that if Mickey Sullivan's proxy wanted a park on the waterfront so badly, he should go buy a shovel and plant some trees himself, because you were busy." Luke stared at her. For 3 seconds, the cabin was dead silent. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. His chest heaved, and he let out a low, rough sound. A dry, shaking laugh that seemed to get dragged up from somewhere deep inside his boots. It was a sound of absolute, overwhelming relief. He rubbed a hand over his face, shaking his head as he chuckled, the hard lines around his eyes completely vanishing. "You know what you just did, right?" Luke asked, his voice thick with amusement. "Frank is currently sitting in the back room of the social club, telling every shift boss from Brooklyn to the Bronx that a 28-year-old librarian is running the family now." "Good," Anna said, setting her mug down and shifting her laptop to the side. "Maybe if they're terrified of me, they'll finally learn how to fold cardboard donation boxes correctly without ripping the corners." Luke smiled, a real, deep, human smile that made him look like a normal guy who had just come in from the snow to see his girl. He didn't stand up. Instead, he shifted his weight and sat right on the floor at her feet, his back resting against the heavy leather of her armchair. He reached back, took her right hand, the small, pale hand with the ink stains on the middle finger, and pulled it over his shoulder, holding it against his collarbone with both of his large, calloused paws. Outside, the winter sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, painting the snowdrifts in long, stretching shadows of violet and gray. 80 miles to the south, the city was waking up for the evening shift. The lights were turning on in the financial towers. Men in heavy dark wool coats were standing in alleyways behind diners, smoking cigarettes and looking over their shoulders. Politicians were checking their phones in back rooms, wondering why Luke Marino hadn't shown up to ruin their afternoon. They were waiting for the hammer to fall. They would be waiting for the rest of their lives. But in the quiet cedar cabin on the hill, the most feared man in New York just closed his eyes, rested his head against a librarian's knee, and listened as she turned a sheet of 300-year-old parchment and began to explain the difference between a fathom and a league. When the city's most feared boss dropped everything to protect the woman who saw his humanity, he proved that true power isn't about the empire you control. It's about the lengths you will go to shield the ones you love. Luke and Anna's story shows that even in a world of concrete, violence, and shadows, loyalty is the only currency that really matters. If this gritty, grounded tale of unwavering protection and dark romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow romance lovers and subscribe to the channel for more immersive, deeply human drama stories every single week. What would you do if you were in Anna's shoes? Drop a comment below.